Welcome to Jesus Changes Everything, a daily podcast dedicated to providing a fresh look at the ancient and glorious truth that Jesus not only reigns, but is busy about the business of bringing all things under subjection, that celebrates the wonder and the glory that he has been given all authority in heaven and on earth. I am so blessed and grateful to have as a guest on today's Jesus Changes Everything podcast, a young man with whom I have quite a bit in common, although we have our differences too. From what I can tell, my guest is tall, thin, and has a full head of hair, so that doesn't have a lot of connection. I'm guessing that he is Baptistic, if not Baptist. But here's what we do have in common. Both of us have been raised by men well known in Reformed circles, well loved and respected, and both very influential men in that world. And both of us have been raised in that fishbowl kind of context. And both of us now serve in gospel ministry. Both of us serve on podcasts. And both of us not only write, I don't know if you know this, Barnabas, in case anybody didn't figure out who you were. I don't know if you know this, but we've both written books on wonder.
You know, I think I knew that because I think you told me via Twitter a few years ago. You know, Twitter has a delightful way of shrinking the world. I mean, there's a lot of things that aren't delightful about it, but it does shrink the world, which has allowed us to kind of build a familiarity and affinity, even though we haven't had a chance to meet in person yet.
Absolutely. Well, and I'm grateful for that as well. I want to, as I mentioned before we went on the air, that I'd like to be able to speak with you again in the future about the book that you put out just last fall about happiness. But today I'd like for us to focus our attention on the pastor's kid. It must have taken a great deal of courage for you to take pen in hand, and maybe you can walk us through the inspiration for the book. And I'd really love to hear, of course everybody would, the whole dynamic of, hey, I'm doing this, and your father writing the foreword for it, and how that all went.
Yeah, so I originally wrote the book in 2012 and 2013, and then so it came out in 2014, and then it was re-released last year by the Good Book Company. So it's originally published elsewhere and then transferred it over. And the Good Book Company, we did some revisions to it, some updates, no major changes, and new cover, and put it back out. But yeah, so you know, like you mentioned in the introduction, grew up as the son of John Piper. He started his pastorate at Bethlehem Baptist Church in Minneapolis 3 years before I was born. And then he retired on my 30th birthday. So nice round number there. So I spent the first 30 years of my life as a pastor's kid, and you know, his ministry continues. So there's still some aspect of kind of living in that context. For most of my life, he wasn't super well known up until, or most of my childhood, up until my high school years, when the Passion Conferences and kind of the young reform movement really caught fire, and he was part of that. So I really was just a pastor's kid, and I say just, you know, there's a lot that goes into that, but yes. That's the context out of which I wrote the book, mostly not celebrity pastor's kid. I really hate that phrase, but it's a reality in today's world. So it's written with the aim of speaking on behalf of pastors' kids in general. And the way that it came about was that, so 2011, 2012, I started putting articles out on the internet and contributing to some different, you know, websites and things. I had come out of recently just a real pretty pretty profound faith struggle that God had used to put me in a context where I finally felt like I knew who I was in Christ. That's
Okay.
probably the shortest way to put it. So a lot of questions, a lot of hypocrisy, a lot of sin, a lot of failure on my part that God redeemed and brought me through and showed me grace and taught me how to repent. And so was at this place where I could begin to be fruitful, I guess, for lack of a better term. And so started to write and got asked to write a couple different articles. One was actually for Table Talk.
Uh-huh.
And it was an article on how to pray for the pastor's family, specifically the pastor's kids. And the other one was for the Gospel Coalition about what are things that pastors' kids need from their dads. And I realized two things in writing those. The first was that I have a lot more to say than 800 words about either of these things. And the second was that they really hit a nerve. I was astounded by the age range and the breadth of ministry kids who started to reach out to me and say, just thank you. Thank you for putting into words things that I'd felt. Thank you for saying something that I've been feeling for decades. I was hearing from people who were 50, 60 years old, others who were 20. And so I just started to think maybe there's more here. I just started to compile all of my thoughts into kind of a messy collection of notes. And then I started to reach out to other pastors' kids just to make sure I wasn't crazy,
Okay.
Because by this time my dad was very well known. And I thought, well, maybe my experience is unique because my dad is more well known than others. And so the pressures on me feel different. So I put it out on Twitter basically and was like, hey, if you're a pastor's kid from any background, would you be willing to answer a few questions for me? And about 50 people responded. And so it was split pretty evenly between men and women, multiple denominations, multiple ages, all across the country. And with two exceptions, everybody said that they had experienced pressures very similar to what I had. So similar expectations placed on the pastor's kid, similar struggles and to some variety in terms of figuring out what it meant to follow Jesus, similar frustrations with some of the negative aspects of, outside criticism of the pastor's family and so forth. And so I went for it and decided to write this thing thinking, I think I'm speaking on behalf of pastors' kids for the most part. And, so that was how it came about. I told my parents I was writing it, but I didn't let them read it until I was done.
Uh-huh.
Because I needed to be able to write it as honestly as I could without feeling like, that part made my dad cringe. I should probably fix it. But I did have in mind the whole time, honor your father and mother.
Right.
So what does it look like to write a book about some hard things from a ministry kid's life that also does not throw my parents under the bus?
Right.
I hope my dad's willingness to write the foreword indicates that I succeeded at not throwing them under the bus. But his first words in the foreword are, "You may ask me, was this book hard for me to read?" And the answer is yes.
Uh-huh.
So it hit some nerves there for sure.
Well, and that doesn't mean that you've thrown him under the bus. It means that you either reminded him of things that he already knew or brought to light some things that he might not have known. And, I think that's perfectly fitting and appropriate, especially when you're zealous to do it the way in which you did it. As I'm listening to you, I'm feeling impatient to ask my own question about my own experience. And in many ways, this is also we have something relatively in common in that most of the people that I meet today are people who have known my father as a well-known theologian. Most of the people I met growing up did not.
Right.
And so I was, and it wasn't, my dad wasn't a pastor at the time. He's running this organization at the time called the Ligonier Valley Study Center. And my hardest difficulty was trying to explain to my friends what my dad did. People show up in their, Volkswagen Beetles and their long hair, and they hang out at our house. And my dad talks to them. It's pretty much all I knew. So it wasn't again until he got older, or until I got older, that he had an increasing reach. But then I had this experience that is, I think, somewhat unique to the children of people who are well known in a particular circle. Uh, did you have this where people wanted to be close to you to sort of take in some of the reflected glory of your father?
Yes, 100%.
Yeah.
And I will say that from about age 18 to probably 27, 28, I didn't handle that very well. I generally resented those people. I didn't always respond outwardly badly, but I definitely harbored resentment at them. And sometimes I was just a jerk, depending on kind of what the authority structure was in the context.
Uh-huh.
But it didn't help any that out of college, I went into Christian publishing.
Right.
And so I worked again. I planted myself in a sphere where he had a lot of influence. And so, yeah, but even to this day, people try to get access to him through me. Hey, will you pass this question on to your dad? No, I won't. He has assistants for that. But God has helped me grow in my appreciation for my dad, both as just our relationship and his ministry as a whole, though, so that when people express kindness towards him, I appreciate that now. Where there was a time where I just didn't want to hear it. I didn't want to hear anything about him. I was tired of being associated with that, as opposed to like, hey, what about me? And yeah, thankfully I've been able to kind of hopefully mature past some of that.
Did you ever have this experience, Barnabas, where maybe someone is putting on a conference, they're relatively new at the whole conference game, and so they invite you, and they're driving you to the airport so you can fly home, and they're asking you how you liked it, did they treat you okay, because they're a little bit insecure about how they did, and then finally the question comes after you are gracious and kind and positive. Oh, yes, I was very well treated. Thank you so much. I appreciate the opportunity. And then the question comes, well, do you think maybe your dad might be interested in coming sometime in the future?
The closest I've gotten to that is guest on a podcast, because my any sort of public ministry I was in was late enough in the game that people didn't think they would have access in the same way.
They were too smart with you. With me.
Yeah. Well, but I think probably also just in terms of the internet, with the rise of the internet, my dad's his sphere of influence expanded enough that I just don't ever speak at the same kinds of places that he would. Like, they look at him and go, oh, he's speaking to 70,000 people at Passion.
Right.
I'm speaking to like 45 pastors in Tupelo, Mississippi. These are not the same things. So I have gotten that on podcasts, though, where I'll be a guest and, man, loved having you on. So, it was great. Yes. Thank you so much. Hey, do you think your dad would ever come on this podcast? I don't know. My dad doesn't really do podcasts. So
right. Yeah. Well, on that whole gatekeeping thing, my standard response was always, in order to not make enemies, I wouldn't laugh at them and say, no, you don't have a chance. I would direct them to somebody else, but I would also say, look, I'd love to help you out, but if I start anyway taking on the role of a gatekeeper, that's going to be my job 24/7, and I don't think that's why God put me here.
Yeah.
To do that. So as I'm listening to you, though, I think maybe this would be another distinction. I could be misreading my own internal emotional response, but resentment was less of a problem for me than distrust. That the people that were wanting to be friends, I felt myself sort of closing up towards and isolating from, because I believed that's what they were interested in. And it wasn't, I'm mad at you. It's, I don't trust you enough to be open and vulnerable with you.
That is an interesting distinction for sure. I think I was able to avoid that to a degree for two reasons. One, when I was 18, I moved from Minneapolis to the Chicago area. So like, as I started to develop my friends that would then become adult friends, it's hard to get access to my dad from 400 miles away. And so I was able to kind of like, it's just easier to kind of wade through that. So my friends growing up, these are just my childhood friends. These are kids I went to church with. Like, my dad wasn't special to them. He was just Pastor John, you know? Right. And so they were just in and out of our house or whatever, just friends. Then when I got into publishing, I had to kind of recalibrate, because now there's people are trying to get at him for endorsements, forwards, book deals, whatever it is. And yeah, they think that I have special access. No, what they don't realize is that the person my dad will say no to fastest is me. He's going to be he'll say no to them too. He'll just say it nicer. With me, he's just like, no, not going to do that. And so, yeah, the mistrust aspect there was, I had to learn to have a pretty sensitive read on, is this person approaching me because there's a genuine opportunity for friendship or for partnership, like business partnership, ministry partnership, or is this like a glad-handing, smarmy effort at gaining access? Right. And it becomes pretty easy to tell. Like, after a while, you kind of have this little radar that you're like, oh, smarmy. Don't trust this.
Well, it may be that I'm too cynical, that my smarm radar is a little too sensitive and goes off too quickly. Perhaps it comes not just from a lifetime of my own experience, but watching my dad. My dad was so, and I think your dad is probably very much like my dad in this way. My dad was profoundly naive and wasn't aware of a lot of people who buttered him up and manipulated him and were not sincere in their friendship.
It's funny. I don't know if my dad is naive. He is impervious, however. He's so single-minded. And I mean that as a compliment. The way that he judges people is not based on what they can contribute to his life. He is not going through life gauging, business deals. What do they have to offer? How, like, there's no leverage. He doesn't know how to leverage anything. So he's a terrible book marketer. But that's also part of what makes him wonderful, because he doesn't look at a person and go, what do I get out of this person? He looks at this person and goes, who is this person? Yes. Exactly. And so if they're trying to butter him up, I mean, good luck. It's just, it doesn't work. Absolutely. He's impervious. And so he's nearly impossible to use, but that protects him. So even if he doesn't know that it's happening, there might be naivety. It's also to his benefit. And he does not get used by people. And I think it's pretty much because he's just there for one reason. He's there to preach. He's there for the gospel, and he views people in those categories only, really.
There was a time 10 or 15 years ago when I was fairly regularly on the internet engaging in battle with a fellow who's a lot smarter than I am and a lot more successful than I am, who's also the son of a well-known Reformed theologian. His name is David Bahnsen. And Bahnsen and I would typically go at each other over political issues.
That always goes well on the internet. I'm glad you engaged in that. Yeah.
But what's interesting is after watching people on the internet squawk at him because of whether it's, well, I know your father, if he were alive today, would be on this side of the issue with me, or I know your father would be disappointed in you for you doing this. And even if that person might be agreeing with me, I'm like, I would never, ever play that card. Mm-hmm. And now David and I are friends. And in fact, he's been a guest on my program. Just the other day, I saw, again, someone on the internet picking at or being rude to Vodi Bakkum's son-in-law
Yeah, I saw
in
that.
connection with him while he's in the
Oh,
hospital.
that made me so mad. First of all, because I know Vodi's son-in-law and he's a wonderful man,
I'm
as is
sure he
Vodi's
is.
daughter. I love them both. They're both, but also just the whole premise of the comment just
Yeah, it's awful.
pissed me all the way off. Yeah,
Yes.
I was so mad.
Well, here's my question for you. Have you ever been in a place where, of course, you don't have the junior struggle that I have,
Right.
where
Yes.
someone has mistaken something that you taught for something your dad taught, or someone has squawked at your dad because of something that you were saying or teaching?
Um, I don't think I've ever been mistaken for my dad in any context. I think the tacit assumption is that I will fall in line with everything my dad says.
Right.
And so what I do get a fair amount of your father would be disappointed in you. And I was just like, that's funny because I talked to him on the phone recently and he said he loved me and he was proud of me. I feel like maybe he knows better than you do how he feels about me. But yeah, so I don't get it as bad as some people do, but there's a definite assumption that I should fall in line exactly with my dad. Which I don't on, I mean, I do on major issues, but
Right.
there are things we disagree on. Or people ask me, what would your dad think about this? Either something that I've said or an issue going on. And I'm just like, he's a public figure. You can ask him. Twitter's an open website. By all means,
Right.
tweet at John Piper and ask him. He won't respond, but ask anyway.
That's absolutely right. Well, I've had that experience multiple times, and ironically, I've been praised for things that he's done, and he's been insulted for things that I've done. But there's also been a time or two where he's gotten credit for things that I've done. But I remember one time where I was basically charged with a perceived failure on his part, or at least asked to answer for it.
Yeah.
And the fella came up to me and he said, "Why hasn't your father been more zealous to take this biblical idea of the holiness of God and get it out there into the third world and spread it out there like he should?" And that fellow was your dad that said that to me.
That was before he read The Pastor's Kid.
Yes, it was.
I probably hadn't written it at that point. I will say this about my dad. I bet if you brought that up to him, he would apologize.
Oh, I'm sure he would.
Instantaneously. Because, I mean, one of my favorite things about my dad is, he's 75 now, and he is so willing to go, "Oh, I made so many mistakes." Like he's rigidly stuck in his ways about some things, but in terms of mistakes that he's made, ministry errors, making judgment calls and getting it wrong. And I look at that and I go, I would like to be like that when I'm 75. Cause
Amen.
I tend to double down on my errors. And I think he's grown in his willingness to say, "Yeah, I screwed that up." And I think that's an instance that he would say, "Yeah, I screwed that up."
Well, I didn't raise it to make him feel bad by any stretch. It was,
Right.
My perspective was, God bless John Piper. He's really passionate about this issue, and he should be. And I admire him and look up to him, and have never stopped. I remember the first time I heard your father preach. The Evangelical Press Association convention was in Minneapolis, and some friends came and took us that Sunday morning and got to hear your father. The year before, we had been in Chicago, and we went to Willow Creek that Sunday, and it was quite a difference.
Yes.
Willow Creek versus Bethlehem. Do you feel like that when you put the book out? I'm trying to find let me give you another story on honoring and that challenge and those disagreements. I don't know if you've ever visited St. Andrew's Chapel, where my father preached.
No.
beautiful building, of course. And in the building, there are these beautiful paintings done by some really highbrow artist. He's not so highbrow that he's dead, but he will be when he is. And they include a picture of Jesus being taken down from the cross, a picture of Jesus that's connected with the apocalypse, big, massive paintings. And someone came onto my own website and posted this thing, R.C. Sproul and the Second Commandment. and wanted
I knew where that was going.
Wanted my take on what that was all about. And I titled my response, R.C. Sproul Jr. and the Fifth Commandment. Said, I'm not even going to bother answering your question, because the truth is we do disagree, and I'm just not I've got only so many hours in a day. I don't need to talk about the things we disagree about. Right. So if you want to fuss at him at it, go right ahead, but I'm not going to defend him, and I'm not going to attack him. Your father, I know, in many ways, even more than my father. Your father has a reputation for humility and gentleness and passion, and a selflessness that I think elevates him to a level of Protestant sainthood that's well above my father. But, you and I both know about them putting their pants on one leg at a time. Are you able to protect an appropriate level of respect for your dad when you're living in light of probably people being over the top about it and therefore maybe tempted to push back?
No, I haven't always been able to. I think, along part of, I mentioned earlier, kind of coming to a place of not resenting those who honored my dad, or who kind of, honored is the wrong word, adore sometimes in sort of weird, unhealthy seeming idolatrous ways. Growing out of resentment to them corresponded with me coming to a much better understanding of how to appreciate and love my dad, well, both my parents, for who they are, not for who they are upheld as.
Right.
Because it is, when everybody is kind of adoring and sometimes even falsely exaggerating the goodness of them, it's so easy to just take the other side and look at yeah, but you don't know about this, and all the times that, he was unfair here, and he, whatever dumb gripes we had as kids and things like that.
Vegetables.
Yeah. Or like, just every parent screws up, and, thankfully my memory is bad, so I don't have a catalog of those things for my parents, but it's easy to harbor the resentment at them. And so, and then the other thing is, as you grow up, you grow in awareness, both of where your parents were right and where your parents were wrong, where you wish they had done something different. I could tell you things that I wish my parents had done for me. And I've talked to them about these things and whatever, none of which has anything to do with how much I should love and honor my parents.
Amen.
And so that's been I think the trajectory for me is going from, the pendulum swings from, I wish everybody would stop praising them because if only they knew how frustrating and stupid they were, to, kind of, they screwed me up, and like, I struggle with all this because of them, to God doing a fair amount of humbling in my life, to the place of realizing there are things about them I wish had been different. I can't change any of those things. They're the parents that God gave me. And also, they're really good parents. They have loved me profoundly. They built such a biblical foundation in my life. I'm in ministry now solely because my parents faithfully taught me the word and have never ceased to pray for me. And that I just wouldn't be in this position otherwise. I've tried very hard to screw up my life multiple times. And I think their prayers and steadiness have been things that God used. And then just all the normal ways that parents love in terms of providing and carpooling and reading books and just the normal life stuff. They did those things too. And so who am I? I just need to remember those things. And other people's reactions exist outside of the knowledge that I have. My relationship with my parents is its own thing. Other people's observations of them might be accurate, might not, doesn't really matter. That's their interactions with something my dad wrote, etc.
Right. Excellent. That's a great place for us to stop. But before we do, two things. One, as we mentioned before we started, I'm hoping that you'll be willing to come back on and we can talk more about your newest book. But two, in case there are those who would like to know about that or this book, can you give us some contact information for our listeners if they would like to follow you, order these books, those kinds of things?
Yeah, I have a website, barnabaspiper.com. I occasionally write there. It's mostly collections of things that I have written. It's where my podcast, The Happy Rant, is housed. And then you can find my books there. So the most recent one is Hoping for Happiness. The Pastor's Kid is there, as well as a couple others. I'm on Twitter, just at Barnabas Piper. If you'd like to criticize me, you can tweet at John Piper. I would recommend that instead. But I do enjoy Twitter and interacting with people, generally speaking. So yeah, I would love to interact with listeners there.
Terrific. Well, thank you so much for being with me, and I look forward to the next time. And God bless you. God bless you for your courage and for your service to the kingdom, and for speaking for pastors' kids all over.
Well, thank you.
You've been listening to the Jesus Changes Everything podcast, a production of Dunamis Fellowship, the teaching outreach of Dr. R.C. Sproul Jr. If you've enjoyed this podcast, we encourage you to subscribe, which you can do at all the usual outlets, to tell your friends, and to spread the word. To learn more about the work of Dunamis Fellowship, please visit rcsproulJR.com and join us next time on Jesus Changes Everything.